should just stay up all night on Saturday
There
and be
we
good.
stay up all night.
Yep. Then you
Oh,
just
like jet lag.
it just
Ryan's advice for dealing with the time change is stay up all night. My
right.
advice for dealing with the time change is move to Arizona.
Yeah,
Yeah, there you
Hawaii.
go.
Hawaii has it too.
All right, let's talk about a question. We are running out of questions. We have tonight's and then we have one more, so I need some more questions. But we do have one for tonight. Tonight's question is, how do I love people I don't like? Which I love how that's how that's how that's worded.
God does have a sense of humor.
Yes, very very timely question. So, without further ado, here we go with our assumptions. Honestly, it's a pretty straightforward question, but what comes to my mind immediately, do I have to? Because the question is, how do I love people I don't like? Not do I have to? So immediately I say, do I really have to do this? Well, unfortunately, I don't have the greatest news for you, but I do bring this to you as a possibility for us to discuss. In First Corinthians chapter 5, Paul is writing, of course, to the church in Corinth, and he says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons, not at all meaning the immoral of this world or the greedy and robbers or idolaters, since you would then need to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother or sister who is sexually immoral or greedy or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or robber. Do not even eat with such a one.
Mm.
So I'm thinking maybe this is our out. I'm thinking that this has to do with, there's this previous letter that we don't have. So we're not entirely sure what he's referring to, but something about how, how the people of God are supposed to be or not supposed to be interacting with people who are outside of their community. But now Paul is specifically addressing if someone who bears the name of brother or sister, so that's, other people who claim faith, so people who are in the community of, they wouldn't have called themselves Christians at this point, but the people who followed the way of Jesus, calling themselves brother or sister, if those people are behaving in these ways, then you are not supposed to associate with them. You're not even supposed to eat with them, which is really interesting because Paul is the same guy who tells the Jews, now, he's Jewish. He was a Pharisee before he got into this whole Jesus thing. And so he knows the law. He understands the law. He followed the law as closely as possible. And for Jews, to who you eat with influences you, who you are, whether you're pure or impure, whether you can participate in particular Jewish rituals, that type of thing. So it's possible that what he's talking about here is, similar with the eating. Instead of being worried about eating with Gentiles because they, eat impure foods or, do impure things and don't clean them, don't ritually cleanse themselves properly. Instead of worrying about that stuff, you should be worrying about what rubs off on you from other people who are behaving badly. Now, this does not explicitly say you should not associate with people that you don't like. It would be great if it said that because that would answer our question. It doesn't really say anything about whether or not you like these people. But what struck me about this was who is actually going to call themselves any of these things? Very, it takes a lot for someone, for example, drunkard. It takes a lot for someone to come to a point in their life where they are acknowledging that they have a problem with alcohol, right? And to find, to get the treatment that they need. Um, I think it's pretty rare for someone to be wandering around saying, "Yes, I'm an alcoholic," but then doing nothing about it. Or, wandering around saying, "Yes, I'm a greedy jerk. I want to collect everybody else's hard-earned money and get everything for myself." Nobody really, thinks poorly about themselves. They're always making excuses for themselves as much as possible. And so I just wonder, is it possible that, somebody you don't like is one of these things, or you think that they are one of these things, but they don't think that they are? So can we use this as an excuse to get out of this whole having to love people we don't like thing? What do we think? Is that good enough?
I don't know if the lampshade test is really the best criteria for.
Fine, fine. Just trying, just shooting my shot here.
Well,
This is not an easy thing to have to deal with.
so, but wouldn't it just be implied that you wouldn't like these people?
You would think so.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't want to hang out with people like that. Although I'm sure that, like you said, they wouldn't. I don't know.
If you're willing to think this about someone, you probably don't like them, right?
Right.
If you like someone, you're going to give them the same benefit of the doubt that you give yourself. So even if they are, even if it's pretty bald, this person went into somebody's house and stole stuff from them. They are a robber, but I don't want to call them a robber because I like them. They're my friend. And so I'm going to come up with every excuse under the sun why this has nothing to do with, their identity. This has to do with something that they did, which is not connected to who they are. Um, it's the same thing as the example of driving fast on the highway. I drive fast on the highway because I'm late or because I have somewhere really important I need to be, or because of my circumstances. That other guy drives fast on the highway because he's an idiot, right? It's who he is. It's not who I am. It's it's what's happening to me. And so we have this bias, and we're going to talk about bias in a little bit. But we have this bias that if it's ourself or somebody that we like, we make excuses for them. And if it's somebody that we don't like, then we refuse to make excuses for them. So I think you're right that if we are labeling anybody this way, then we probably already don't like them.
But that's enabling.
Yes, it is, and we do it all the time.
I know. But that doesn't make it right. I mean,
all right. Well, we're gonna get to some of that conversation too here in a little bit.
that saying, I love you, but I don't like what you did.
Mm, yeah. To try to see who the person truly is, but also understand that they need to be held accountable for their choices. Perhaps that's challenging too. But do not even eat with such a one, Paul says. Unfortunately, this is all I've got for excuses not to have to follow this whole concept of loving people I don't like. Because we get to do I have to, and we have endless examples. 1 John 4, we love because he first loved us. Those who say, I love God and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God who they have seen, cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. So if they are a brother or sister, we have to love them, because if we want to love God, then that's part of the deal.
Sounds terrible.
It does sound terrible. I'm getting commentary from the peanut gallery back here today. And then even if that isn't enough for you, 1 John, written by some apostle, disciple, follower at some point along the way. But how about Gospel of John, direct quotation from Jesus himself? I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So pretty much, if we want to ask the question, do I have to love people I don't like? Then the answer is, if you want to follow Jesus, if you want to be a disciple of Jesus, if you want to be a Christian, then yes, you have to.
And
So
this verse doesn't talk about brothers and sisters, though. So
no,
this verse isn't saying those that believe as you do. This is
right,
saying everybody.
right. And depending on, your context, your brothers, who are your brothers and sisters, right? We can carry that all the way back to Genesis. Am I my brother's keeper? Who is my brother? Who is my sister? Who is my neighbor? Everyone, right? So, since I couldn't weasel out of this, figuring out this whole thing about, do I really have to love these people? Yes, I have to. Well, why? I'm feeling very whiny today, I think. I don't want to, so why do I have to? So, Matthew chapter 5 gives us an example of why it's important that we do this. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, this is Jesus, of course, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So again, we're getting commandments from Jesus, but this time he explains a little bit about why, which is thoughts.
But we're not perfect.
So there's some more excuses. We're not perfect. Why should we be perfect?
And we can't, I don't even know how to be perfect. I've thought about this because the sermons lately have all been about, love your enemies. And David used the phrase Jesus in skin or something, Jesus with skin.
Yeah.
But we can't be Jesus. So how can we love like him when we can't possibly be him?
Well, that's the call, right? That's the ideal. And just because we can't get there doesn't mean we shouldn't ever do anything to try, right?
Well, we do try.
I'm not, I'm never going to be a prima ballerina. So does that mean that I should quit my ballet class? Nah, I can work on it. I can get a little better each time and enjoy it and get a little exercise. Doesn't mean that I'm, ever going to be good at it or look good.
That's not an answer, Katie.
Just because last week I answered the question doesn't mean that I'm going to answer the question every week, Karen.
Oh, okay.
Don't get used to it.
Okay.
I mean, I can confirm
Going,
that tax collectors love their, love their people. So, as a former one, so
Well, they love the people that they love, right? Or the
Yep.
people that love them. So
which
Jesus is
oddly enough are
definitely
not that many.
calling us. Sorry, go ahead.
Which oddly enough, when you're a tax collector, are not that many.
Yeah. Um, but Jesus is definitely calling us to something higher than your average person, saying, well, if you want to be like those other people, then fine. You can just show love to those who love you. But I have a bigger task for you. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Why? So that you may be children of your Father in heaven. So loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you in some way makes you a child of God. I think we could go on and
did,
on and on about, works righteousness and all that kind of thing here. That's not what we're doing today. We could, but we're not going to. But I think,
did,
no, go ahead.
no, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, did Paul have um, access to these scriptures?
No.
Okay, because the first scripture that you shared is so diametrically opposed. I mean, it's just, how could he? No, I don't know. It just seems odd that as a follower of Christ, he would be that narrow-minded.
Well, I think Katie somewhat answered it by the fact that she said we don't know actually the context of the response of like the first letter that caused this
Right.
response. So we may
Right.
not know the full question that we have the answer to.
These things are complicated. And don't worry, I'm going to complicate it as much as possible for you before the end of the conversation.
Well, I do find it interesting that, after, giving the reason of why, the very next thing is, and oh, by the way, you get the same rain, same everything, sun as everyone else. So, it's almost kind of a pushback against the quid pro quo gods of the world that were predominant at that point.
Yeah, what do you get out of it? Like, so why should you love your enemies? So that you may be a child of your Father. But what do you get out of that? Nothing. The same sun rises on the evil and on the good. The same rain falls on the righteous and on the unrighteous. So why should I do this? It's hard work and nobody else is doing it, so why should I do it? Not exactly um not exactly Jesus' most compelling argument for gathering followers on this one. So there's got to be something else going on here. Maybe. Anything else on this one? Okay. So I want to talk about a very famous passage that has to do with loving your enemies because I think we, in some ways, misunderstand. This is similar, but not exactly the same as the version in Matthew. Luke chapter 6. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other one also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. So I think we've got this sense in Christianity of, you know, the uh, the doormat Christian from these types of passages. Well, if anyone hits you, then let them hit you on the other side. If anyone takes away your coat, give them even more than they're trying to take. If someone takes everything that you own, don't ask for it back. Just let them keep it. It's a very passive experience of Christian interpretation. And some in the last couple of decades, scholars have looked at this a little bit more and thought, like you're saying, Ryan, about the context of it. So, this particular piece doesn't have the if someone forces you to go a mile, go the second mile part to it. But that's, kind of in our society. We even have the saying, right? Go the extra mile. That comes specifically from that story, that saying of Jesus, that you should, for those who are your enemies, you should do these things, for them. I think one really important thing for us to look at here um, in terms of the context of this is when it talks about your enemies, we in our society look at that from the perspective of ourselves much more, it seems, than people would have initially received it. And what I mean by that is when we when we talk about something like, your enemies, your anything, your dog, your house, your car, it's about me, right? It's my relationship to the thing. And so when I say my enemies, it's about who are the people that I consider my enemies. But for the people who received this message at the beginning, they would not have necessarily made that a same assumption as us. And I know this is kind of a fundamental thing in our language and in our culture. So hopefully we can kind of get this. So when we say your enemies, we're not saying like from me, I get to define who those people are because I don't like them. It's actually the other direction. My enemies are not the people that I dislike. My enemies are the people who dislike me. Does that make sense? Are we nodding? I can't see anybody's faces right now.
Yes.
Okay, good. So, if you're a peasant in the Jewish countryside, which is already, the backwater of the Roman Empire, you don't really have you don't really have meaningful enemies in terms of, your feelings about people. You don't have the luxury of calling the Romans your enemy, because if you do, they're just gonna get rid of you. Um, you don't have the luxury of calling one of your neighbors your enemy because you have to rely on each other to survive because there aren't enough resources left after the Romans come through and take everything they want for everyone to survive without working together. You might not like that person, but they can't be your enemy. An enemy is is something that is kind of above your station in a way. And I don't know, I haven't really read enough about this to know if that's accurate, but if we give that, if we give that a minute and just let it sit, it kind of makes sense. Because if we flip our assumptions about what we're talking about here, then look at what comes next. It actually makes more sense. It's not my enemies, i.e., the people that I don't like. It's my enemies, the people who don't like me. And when those people don't like me, they behave in a certain way toward me that causes me suffering and pain and difficulty in life. So then, the do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. That kind of, I think, helps to bolster the argument that when it says love your enemies, it's talking about love the people who hate you, not necessarily love the people that you hate. Because it's all about how other people are behaving toward the listener, toward myself. So if we're reading it that way, then it doesn't matter how we feel about other people. It matters what they are doing to us, their behavior toward us. Because we can't really know if deep down inside their heart that person hates me or if they just are used to taking what they want and I'm just, a casualty on the side of the road because I happen to have something that they wanted and they just took it without even considering the fact that I'm a human and I have needs and wants and just like them. So that actually helped me here. And like I said, I don't know how accurate that is historically. I don't know if you can say that people, didn't consider themselves to have enemies, but other people, thought of them as an enemy. I don't know about that, but it does kind of fit, I think, with the context of at least, the literary context here. Um, and it seems like um, a small idea but I think it makes a big difference if we're looking at this in terms of how do I know that someone considers me an enemy? The way that they behave toward me. And so then if I then behave toward them in a way that is contrary to their enemy behavior, then that that creates a dissonance for them, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a couple of slides. It creates a situation for them that is a challenge to their behavior, to their assumptions about who I am to them. Is that making sense? Any thoughts or additions to that?
So is it a status thing? I mean, and I don't know if that's the right word, but if I can't, if somebody considers me an enemy, but I can't consider them an enemy, is that because they have something on me?
So that's what the people that I was reading about this were saying. So let me go to the next slide because this might help to give some more examples. Um, so and we're still this even though we have a new title, this is still kind of within we want to keep in mind these examples that are famous and that we're familiar with, the go the extra mile, the turn the other cheek, the give the shirt as well as the coat type of stuff. The idea being and that's where I kind of don't have the historical understanding that is it really just about the status or is there something else going on there in terms of people's perceptions of enemies. That's kind of where my knowledge is not deep enough to really know if they can be right or not. But what I like about it, even if they're not completely right, in terms of historical context, what I like about it is this idea of kind of turning it around and thinking about the person's behavior toward you rather than your feelings toward them, and then how you respond. Because how you respond is actually incredibly passive aggressive, which
I mean,
I
I
kind of
don't.
love.
I mean, I've
Right.
always interpreted that verse as a lot more like the turn the other cheek. That someone hits you, you're probably not expecting someone hitting you, and so you turn the other cheek and you're standing up there, and you're basically compelling them to prove that they're being evil.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
punch you again, you're just right here expecting it, and you're still not doing anything about it. That looks bad to the
On
community.
them.
If they steal your coat, people may be like, oh, okay. But if they leave you naked in the street,
Right. Right.
again, that is a escalation of like, you're evil. And I'm challenging that directly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess it's not even passive aggressive, right? It's directly aggressive. Not just even, and that's where the cultural context issues come in, and that's where some of these things that I've been reading about, are helpful. So, for example, the going the extra mile part. At this time, historically, when a Roman legion was coming through town, they had these really heavy backpacks and packs of all their supplies that they had to carry around with them. If they saw somebody walking along, minding their own business, by law, they could conscript that person to carry their pack for them. But according to the law, they could only force them to carry it for 1 mile. And so the idea being that if you are conscripted into carrying the pack for this guy, if your entire day is messed up because these Roman soldiers have more status than you and can make you do this thing, and it makes you feel dehumanized and like you don't matter, in the world, and that's kind of part of the point of it, right? To make you feel like you are subhuman in some way, to keep you pressed down. You don't the whole point of it is you have no choice. But when you get to that mile marker and the guy says, okay, give me back my pack, now you have the control. You can say, okay, here, fine, bye, and then it will go on. Or you can say, no, 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 let me do it. Let me carry it for another mile. And number one, that's illegal because the law says that they can only make you do it for 1 mile. So that makes them feel uncomfortable and awkward because now they have to decide if they're going to let you do it or if they're going to fight with you about it. But the very fact that they are having to fight with you about it is undermining the whole system that creates a situation in which you can be conscripted because you are not valuable. You're not a person. And so that's why I think it's kind of brilliant because it's not actually just passive. It's it's aggressive in a way that for that person it forces them to think about this action that I'm sure they've done dozens of other times to other people, and forces them to consider whether this is something that is appropriate or not. Whereas if you just, carry it for the mile and give it back and they keep going on their way, that that doesn't create that moment um, of confusion and even sort of a crisis, and not a spiritual crisis, I guess, for them, but like a moral crisis, an ethical crisis for them that they have to kind of wrestle with this moment of, hey, this person that I have been, or this type of person that I have just been treating like a pack mule for all this time, actually has agency and can make choices and all these types of things. Similarly, with the coat and the shirt, they talked about, if someone takes you to court and they prove that you have wronged them in some way, the giving of your coat was a common judgment because people didn't really have money. You couldn't sue somebody for $1 million because nobody had, nobody had money of any, of any level that would be of meaning to anybody. But if most people had a coat. So if you gave the coat, that was kind of, making good on that debt or on whatever, wrong you've done to them. Um, but if they do that wrongly, if they, if and that's kind of the assumption, if you are a person of the way following Jesus, then you didn't actually do anything wrong. And so if they're taking your coat from you, then the assumption is that they that you haven't done anything wrong and they're taking advantage of you. And if they're already taking advantage of you, instead of being angry about it and, talking bad about them in society and saying, yeah, they took my coat, give them your shirt too. Have them literally have to make the decision that they're gonna, like Ryan, like you said, Ryan, leave you standing naked in the middle of the street. It's kind of funny in a, in a not funny way. But all of these situations, all of these pieces of advice about how to behave in relation to people who treat you like an enemy are actually really undermining the cultural assumptions of the society. They're not passive. They're not just rolling over and letting people do whatever they want. And so this passage from Romans, even though it's not from the same story, actually kind of fits in really well with it because it says, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. So it's funny. I think it's supposed to be a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's also true, right? That when somebody wrongs you, you can wrong them right back, but all that's going to do is just keep escalating the problem. But if somebody wrongs you and you make them look really bad for having wronged you in as public a way as possible, then other people are going to notice that and they're going to lose face, not you, right? So I think we sometimes we read the Bible way too seriously, way too literally. This part about, heat burning coals on their heads, most people interpret that as yes, yes, that your evil enemies are going to go to hell and Satan is going to, burn them forever. I think it's actually just a reference to, to the way that society judges people and to the way that God judges people. Certainly, but I think it's more that cultural, cultural pressure, societal pressure kind of stuff. What do we think about that? Is that a fair interpretation? Like I said, I'm feeling a little less than 100% on it because I'm not clear enough on all the cultural stuff, but I feel like it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, you're fundamentally messing with their. I mean, you're waging psychological warfare on them, is what you're doing.
Right.
Is you're
Right.
playing with their own morality, their own moral system that all humans generally try to operate fairly, given the rules of whatever they're in. So even if you're allowed to abuse an underling, there's limits most of the time. And so when you're compelled outside those limits, it messes with your morality and messes with you, and quite frankly makes you more trouble than you're worth to continue doing that in the future.
Right. Right. And so it's a non-confrontational way to force people to confront their assumptions, the way, the way that they just behave because that's just how it is, right? And I really like that because from, when you live in a world where you have no power, where, if you're not a Roman citizen, you can literally be killed at any time and nobody cares. Nobody will do anything about it. Like, I don't think that we can truly conceptualize of that. I mean, we can try, but I feel like because we have lived for generations in a society where, things might come and go and things change. And certainly right now we're going through some major upheaval. But generally speaking, there are limits. And, the life of a person, um, you would hope would be one of those limits. Um, I think that there are certain populations in the United States who would say, no, that's not true. People that look like me or behave like me or share traits with me are killed all the time and there are no consequences. And so that's not the case. But I think for people who look like us and who are of, the socioeconomic level that we enjoy, we have this assumption that there are limits to the way that you can treat other humans and just have absolutely no consequences. But for these people, they had nothing. They had no power. They couldn't stand up to their enemies, people who were treating them this way. But what they could do was get a little passive aggressive about it and force them to, even if just for a moment, experience that existential crisis of what is it that you're really doing here, in whatever way you can make that possible. And that is the complete opposite of the passive way that we have interpreted these passages for a long time. So I thought that was really, really interesting and really cool. Anything else on this before we move on?
I'm good.
I don't know. I think there are some people that don't have that understanding within them. I think there are people that are built without having any concern for anybody, and they will take anything you can give them without even a thought.
Well, that's
And
why there's more, Karen. I agree with you, but there's more.
oh, well, I can't, it's hard for me because I grew up in the South,
Yeah.
and um and I know what, whoop, excuse me. Never mind. I'll talk about it later.
No, it's okay. We can still hear you.
Well, it's just that I saw what the Black people lived with and
Yeah.
how they were treated, and it made a profound impact on me because my my family was a military family,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no segregation in the military at that time. And so um, I just had it. It was a shock to me to see people treated that way when I finally figured out what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when I felt the hatred from this lady one time when I was in the five and dime store and looking at makeup, and this lady, this she was just furious with me, and I didn't know what I had done. It was so totally off the wall. But I see that still happening today with
Yeah.
the way people are treated, and um, just an example. My caregiver Dora is from El Salvador. In fact, she's there right now, and we had a workman come to the door, and she answered the door, and he said, "Oh, I must have the wrong house, or you must not be the person that I'm looking for," or something like that. And so she said my name, and he said, "Yeah, that's the name." And she said, "Oh, she's here." And I talked to her about it later, and she said he didn't think that I would be able to live in a house like yours.
Yeah.
And she knew it. She felt it. But it had never entered my mind. I mean, but then it made me so angry.
Yeah.
And I don't know how people that are treated that way, how they don't keep from wanting to do this to show people how ugly they are.
Mm-hmm.
How did they? Because if they walk the extra mile, or they did this or they did that, I don't think it would change some of these people. I don't think they would even feel embarrassed about it.
Some of them no, but some yes. And
Okay.
I think that's one of the most important things is you have to, you have to work within your limitations, your situation. Um, I don't think I think the kind of power that the kind of power dynamic that you're talking about is very different than some of the power dynamics that would have been at play with people that were interacting with these audiences on a daily basis.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the kind of people with real power. We're talking about the kind of people who are just one rung above the people with zero power, which sometimes can be the most challenging people to deal with because
Yes.
they can see the bottom and they don't want to be there, and so they're going to work really hard to avoid
Exactly.
rock bottom and do everything they possibly can to hold on to that teeny little sliver of power that they've been given.
Exactly.
But at the same time, they also have experienced that powerlessness in their life.
Good point.
And so if you confront them with that reality, even if they aren't able to um, consciously address and confront that, in that moment, it's something that sticks in them
Yeah.
because it's not the people, the people who have never experienced a feeling of powerlessness in their lives are not are that's what you're describing. The kind of people who cannot fathom a situation where they are not in control because they've never not been in control. Those types of people, this isn't going to work on them. But if you're dealing with the kinds of people that in this type of society where it's so differentiated that you're really only going to be dealing with people that are, maybe two or three kind of rungs up the ladder or down the ladder from you at any given time, those are the types of people that you can make a difference with, even if you're below them, which obviously, the audiences that Jesus is talking to are those people who are at the bottom
Yeah.
of the ladder. Because
Well,
Yeah.
otherwise Jesus would say, hey, let's stand up and revolt against this. Let's speak up. Let's tell them that this is not, how it should be.
and I'm not certain that it doesn't work on the people who it doesn't work on because you, if you let them abuse you to that point, if you normalize that, they're getting more and more and more and more extreme in a system that's not going to be happy about it because they're pushing that limit, pushing that limit, pushing that limit, and they will cross over the line and get smacked down
Mm,
because they pushed too far because nobody ever pushed them until they went over the line that their supervisors or superiors or whatever are like, what is wrong with you?
yeah. Yeah. Because
And
you have
so,
to, that's true. Even if the Roman centurion doesn't see the problem because he's society he's blind to the problems that are that are surrounding him. His leadership is going to say, hey, we have this rule about 1 mile for a reason because we can push people, we can force people to give up the time that it takes to carry your stuff for a mile. But if you start doing it to people for 2 miles, then that's going to push them too far. And then we're going to start having, you know, violent conflict and things like that. That there is power in there is a latent power in that powerless level, and at some point you get pushed hard enough and you find it, and that's the the deepest fear of a tyrant is the people discovering the power that they have, right?
Good point.
So all of those things I think are circling in there. But this is so I love how smart this is, that we are so good at spiritualizing our scripture um and turning it into, nice little fluffy lessons for our children. Yes, if somebody hits you, we shouldn't be violent back. You should just let it go. Let them, hit us back. It's okay. Like we'll take it. No, that's not what this is saying at all. This is saying shame that jerk. you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's giving me hope.
For our current situation.
That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. All right, well let's move on here to some other possibilities and some other ideas. So just at the beginning of this month, the St. James Church Council had a retreat, and we started the day with some Bible study and thinking about this concept of loving others. And in that particular case, it was not specific to loving your enemies, loving people that you don't like, but it was, kind of a general thing. But the main passage that we used was the scene where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. And it was an interesting conversation because a lot of times this some of the details in this passage are even left out of readings or left out of the storytelling because they seem a little bit unnecessary for the story itself. This is the story about Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Um, but I wanted to include um, all of the kind of scene setting stuff for us here because I think it actually has a lot to tell us if we are serious about wanting to figure out how to love people we don't like because we know, we kind of I went through my I don't want to do this. Why do I have to do this? We know that we have to do this, but it's hard and we're trying to figure this out because we want to take our discipleship seriously. This the scene setting stuff before the action really takes place here tells us a lot about that. It says the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, and then we get into the actual action of the scene. So we have this note about how Judas was already pondering how to betray Jesus. That verse seems out of context um, on first glance. Why is that detail put in there? And then this other thing with Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and knowing that he had come from God and was going to God, that the only thing that, kind of the cursory glance at this might mean is, oh yes, he's this high and lofty figure, he came from God, but now he's going to, humble himself and wash his disciples' feet. But I feel like in the context of what we're talking about here, it's actually really interesting because we have an example of what Jesus does in a situation where there is somebody that he doesn't like, somebody that is his enemy. Um, and we know that he knows that this is going to happen because he talks about, the one who will betray me. Um, so we know that he knows about this, and he still chooses to behave in this way and wash Simon or wash Judas's feet. Um, he could have waited for Judas to leave, but he didn't. He still he still served him in this way. And this part about, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God, we could just write that off as, yes, we know that Jesus is, we know that Jesus is God. We know that Jesus is is giving up more dignity than we will ever have to do this for these people. And so why is it, it shouldn't be a big deal for us to do this as well. But if we think about this from this context of loving our enemies or loving people we don't like, and this mention of Judas in the story, Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. Jesus knows that God has set things up so that at the end of the day he will win. God wins. He knows the end of the story. And so it actually, I think, maybe indicates something along the lines of, you know, things like, and this is going to sound really bizarre, but things like your friends betraying you to your enemies who are going to kill you is not an ultimate thing, if I can say something like that. Um, what are ultimate things, and how can we kind of put into perspective our tiffs and our feuds and um, our negative interactions with other people. And obviously, there are situations where it is a big deal. Karen was just talking about one of those examples, um, and having to be kind of in this context where there are people who are suffering, who are being mistreated, and is the call to just say, well, in the end, God will fix everything, so it's okay. We'll just let it go. And I think that's where we have to start, asking more questions, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Um, but this idea of Jesus having that end game in sight allows him to even be willing to show that sacrificial and servant like love to the person who is literally the reason why he ends up being tortured and murdered. So if we are attempting to follow the way of Jesus, then what is our role from that perspective? That especially when it comes to ourselves and our own suffering. I think we're going to talk a little bit more in a minute about other people's suffering, because I think that's different myself. So thoughts on that one?
Okay.
What do you think, Karen?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a difference between the things that are done to you and the things that you see that are done to other people.
Yeah.
When you see the suffering and pain of somebody else, because you can take a lot more than what you see sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's true. Anybody else have anything to say on this one? Okay.
I think I would have had to pinch his toe or something though.
I don't know. Those feet were pretty rough because they didn't have closed shoes, so he probably wouldn't have even felt it if you pinched his toe because their skin's so leathery.
True, true.
So I think here's an even bigger example of this. Jesus is literally hanging on the cross, gasping for breath. He's been beaten and tortured and stripped and laid bare for everyone to see. And his words are, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Now, we do have the possibility, I have to, full transparency here. We do have the possibility that this particular verse is actually added later to the manuscript of Luke. Um, a lot of the ancient manuscripts, the oldest manuscripts that we have of the Gospel of Luke, don't include this verse, this sentence. It just skips from the one before right to the one after. So maybe we could decide to say, oh well, then that's not original, so we don't have to worry about this. We don't have to follow this. We don't have to study this. We don't have to understand this. But I think it actually, as I tend to do, when we look at things that are, what um, biblical literalists would consider to be a challenge to their interpretation of the Bible, I actually find it to be an interesting way of highlighting this verse. Because if this was not part of the original story, if this was not part of the original gospel writer's story and writing, then what is the intention of the people who added it later in adding it later? That's kind of what I would ask myself. And it is um, it is a reference to Isaiah 53, which is one of the suffering servant psalms. Um, the um, the idea, of course, being that Jesus is the fulfillment of Scripture in a variety of different ways. But this early church theological concept that Jesus is the fulfillment of many pieces of Scripture, but specifically the fulfillment of the suffering servant in that occurs in Isaiah. Um, and for this, if we consider this particular reference, it says, "Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured himself out to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." So this little, this seemingly almost throwaway sentence that may or may not have been added, after the fact, Father, forgive them, brings us to this whole verse, which reminds us of Jesus' choices to pour himself out to death, to number himself among the transgressors. Why? Because it results in him being allotted this portion of the great, dividing the spoil with the strong. So there's this element of reward for the behavior of suffering and sacrificing oneself. Now, I want us to be really careful about that, because that then if we take that concept and we kind of stamp it back onto the conversation that we were just having a few minutes ago, then that takes us right back into, being passive recipients of suffering and just letting people smack us around and treat us poorly and leave us standing naked in the street. And that's not where I think Jesus wants us to go. But I think there is some level of reminder that how God operates in the world is an upside down kind of way of doing things. That we know that if you just outbully the bully, all that's going to do is make that bully feel resentful and not result in any kind of reconciliation. And then the next time, some bigger bully is going to, bully you into submission, and it's just going to keep perpetuating the problem. And so what we understand about God is brilliant in turning things on their heads and not just changing circumstances in terms of, which dictator is in charge today, but there is no dictator. That that God as the leader is not the same thing as just another king, just another tyrant, just another dictator who's going to replace the last one with whatever he thinks is the better way to do this, or he can make himself feel better by saying, well, the last one, treated people like this, and I'm gonna walk that back just a little bit. Jesus is, completely overturning the entire system, including in this moment of forgiving. And he says them, and we can talk about all the different thems that he's referring to here. He's referring to the soldiers who are doing this. He's referring to the other people who are being killed with him, that are kind of lumped in with him as criminals. He's referring to the mob of people who were there jeering at him and calling for his death. He's ultimately talking about everyone, us, right? Because we, in our way, participate in killing Jesus by participating in the status quo of the world. And so if we're truly serious about following Jesus, and I think if we're studying how to love people we don't like, how to love our enemies, then we're pretty serious about it, because we really want to try our best at this thing. Then we have to think about, the way that um, we contribute to the suffering of Jesus, and the way that we follow in the way of Jesus by suffering, suffering on our in I don't know which words I want to use. I don't want to say suffering with him, or suffering on his behalf, or Jesus suffered. Help me out here, guys. Jesus suffered once and for all, but we're called to, pick up our cross and be the incarnation of that, for within our own context.
Well, I mean, I kind of read this a little bit different, in the
Okay.
sense that what I think it is it's a get out of jail card for everybody else. Because, someone does something really bad to you. What does the Bible say? God's going to get the vengeance for you. You don't do it, God's going to get it for you. And, you know, they did something really horrible, and he's literally saying, no, don't do the bad thing to them. I'm forgiving them for it. But, there is a promise of seeking the retribution that you are denying yourself will be done by God. So this is him saying, don't do it.
Mm, yeah. So this last one, where was that one? Vengeance is mine, I will repay. And I really struggle with those things, leave room for the wrath of God. Um, because I would point to other places where it talks about, God reconciling all things to God's self, and having no room left for wrath. God chooses to um, take out all of that wrath, not on that person that you don't like or that hurt you, but on Jesus. Jesus takes all of that onto himself. And, I think we struggle with that as humans, because we want to see our sense of justice. And it's certainly not justice that that person hurts me. And so God should hurt that person, but instead chooses to hurt Jesus. That doesn't feel just to us. But again, it, it's that the difference between, us as humans and God and God's understanding that if God is just going to be the one to punish, then that's not really fixing anything. That's like, the Hatfields and the McCoys. Well, you killed my brother. I'm not going to kill you. Instead, I'm going to get my grandpappy to kill you. Like it's the same thing, right? But it's a whole undermining of the system that God demands justice in this situation where I've been hurt, but instead of taking it out on the perpetrator, God's going to absorb that wrath.
Well, see, that undermines not getting your vengeance now, because you can then get your vengeance and then start working your way back from, well, I shouldn't have been so vengeful, and you
Right.
get the cake and eat it too. And so I just kind of view it as a divine mystery of how this person probably goes to heaven because they got faith, but they did something really bad. How that reconciles is something that is sorted out in a way that we don't actually have an answer to.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely don't have the answer to that. And I don't know that we will anytime soon because I don't think we can, I don't think that we can comprehend it. So I think you're right. There's some level of mystery in all of this, which is dissatisfying in a lot
Yeah,
of ways.
that's the joy of being a Lutheran. If you get a question too complicated, you can just say it's a divine mystery
Yeah,
because
right.
we're not smart enough to figure it out.
Right, right. All right. So I want to talk just a moment, go off. We've been very heavy on Bible for this particular one because um there's just so much. I mean, it goes on and on and on because this is all about how do we love people we don't want to love, right? But I did want to throw this out there because Karen's question was, how do we make this work? How do we figure this out? And I just wanted to throw out here a little bit of Ben Franklin, the Ben Franklin effect. So, um, cognitive dissonance is whenever you um, whenever you experience something that results in a tension between different thoughts that you're having or different attitudes you're having or different actions that you're undergoing or some combination thereof. So Ben Franklin's famous example of this is that he had this man that he worked with um, in the Congress that didn't like him. And he said that the way that he dealt with this in his autobiography, he tells the story that he writes a letter to the man that he knows doesn't like him and asks him to borrow a book. And the man thinks, oh, yes, I will lend this book to this person because that makes me feel superior to him. And so he lends the book. And Ben Franklin reads the book and puts a note with the book that is just effusive with thanks for for lending this book. It was so helpful to me. Thank you so much for doing this for me, and sends it back to the man. And he says the next time they saw each other in Congress, the man went out of his way to come and talk to Ben Franklin. And then after that, they were friends for the rest of their lives, for the rest of that man's life, who he passed away before Ben Franklin. And he says the reason for that, and this is the saying that he puts with it. He that has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another than he whom you yourself have obliged. So we think, that the best way to get people to like us is to do nice things for them. But if they already don't like us, then in order to avoid cognitive dissonance, they are going to interpret our actions in some kind of nefarious way. Oh, they're just trying to, whatever. Oh, that pencil that they're offering to lend me, they must have licked it or something, or they're trying to get at us in some sneaky way. So that's not the way to do it. But if you ask that person to do something nice for you, and then they do it, then you've actually kind of tricked them into believing that they like you. Because if you are doing nice things for someone, then logically it must be because you like them, right? And so this moment of dissonance between your negative attitude toward the person, but your positive behavior toward the person creates this tension. And the way that you resolve that is to say, "Oh, well, I must not dislike this person as much as I thought I did." And so it's this psychological trick that that kind of fixes the problem. And it actually a lot of different researchers have done studies on this. One of them that the was in I have my notes here, 1969. They the study was they had they did a competition. It was a question, just a question competition that you had to answer so many questions, and if you answered, more than 50% of them correct or something like that, then you were quote unquote a winner, and you were given money when you were the winner. And the people who were in the study thought that was the study, and they didn't know what was really going on. After they won and were given the money and they left, the researcher actually went back to them and said, I actually used my own money to pay the winners, and I'm really strapped for cash. I can't pay my rent this month. Would you give me back your winnings? And it turned out that the people who gave back the money um, increased how much they liked that person. After all of this went down, then another researcher came in and said, did a survey on how much they liked this person. And the people who gave back the money actually liked the guy more than the people who were not asked to give the money back, which you would think wouldn't make any sense. But because of this Ben Franklin effect and the cognitive dissonance that it creates in these situations of, I'm losing something, but it must be because I like this person. It creates, it kind of creates its own reality, which I
Well,
think
I
is
mean,
really interesting.
it's you just invested in the person.
Right.
Like it's you it's like any other place where you put your money to grow into something. You invest in somebody, you assume that it's going to benefit in more ways than the cash necessarily would generate, basically.
Yeah. And so why am I willing to do that? Well, I must like this person. I must trust this person. This person must have some kind of quality that has made me feel confident to invest in them, in our friendship, or in whatever it is that they can accomplish for me or for society, or whatever it is. And so what the Ben Franklin effect tells us, Karen, is that if you don't like any of this other stuff because you're frustrated with the idea of subtly convincing people to take a look at themselves in the mirror because they're not going to look, or just having to slog through this following Jesus thing day after day after day. Here's another possibility: trick yourself into liking the person instead of disliking the person.
Well, what happens when you do and do and do for somebody, oftentimes they come to resent you. Because they feel then that they're not reciprocating. So you've not allowed them to grow, and develop themselves because you're constantly doing for them and giving to them. And I've done that my whole life.
And they have that
And I think
thing.
that's what I'm looking at now is like, oh, that's not the way to do it.
Yeah.
You can give
You,
yourself away and it's not going
right.
to change that.
Because now you have obliged that person to you, as
Yeah.
England puts
So
it.
they feel like they owe you.
Right. And now they're mad because they don't like you and they owe you something. And how dare you make me
Yes.
feel obliged to somebody that I don't like?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it would be better to let them do something for you.
Yeah.
I get that.
Actually, if you're trying to mess with them, it sounds like you're supposed to do nice things for them and not let them do something to reciprocate to drive them really up the wall.
So we keep
Well,
on with people in a variety of different ways.
that's a way to look at it.
Yep. I think Jesus has a sense of humor. So as we get toward the end here, I want us to go back to some of the things that we've said before, and we were kind of already getting to this, but I wanted to just spend a few minutes with this. Um, this idea that, love has to be in context. So love one another just as I have loved you. And I think again, when we're reading, does just as I loved you mean that, love is washing each other's feet? Maybe, but we have to look at the context of, what does love look like in a particular circumstance. This is a quote that I've used in this class before, but I think it's really helpful when we're talking about love because we know now that love isn't just like the mushy gushy feelings. Love is what we do. But I think just reminding ourselves that this is a hard thing that we have to discipline ourselves with. So Eric Fromm in his book The Art of Loving, love is a decision, it is a judgment, it is a promise. Love isn't something natural. Rather, it requires discipline, concentration, patience, faith, and the overcoming of narcissism. It isn't a feeling, it is a practice. So earlier we were talking about, these people that were described as revilers and robbers and drunkards and all these things, and how it is highly unlikely that those people are going to define themselves in that way. Now, sorry, Ryan, did you have something?
No,
Okay. Now we're being told that we need to look at ourselves and find our narcissism because we all have it. We all have it, even if we're the most caring, loving, giving person in the world. It's biological. We have to have some level of narcissism because we wouldn't survive without it. We wouldn't survive without, being born and having the instinct to cry when we need nutrients. Otherwise, we would have starved to death. Um, Now, we had, hopefully we had a parent who recognized our needs and was willing to meet them even without the crying part. But we don't know that because we're not them. And so we learn over time, we learn trust and build those relationships with people. But ultimately, my survival is on me, right? So it's not a bad thing to want to survive, to see ourselves and our own thrive. It's part of our biology. It's part of evolution. But to love, we actually have to overcome that in some way. And I don't think, and I don't, well, I don't know what Eric Fromm thinks about this, but I would say that I don't think overcoming means that you have no narcissism, because again, there's got to be some level of believing that I am worth the resources that it takes to sustain me in the world, um, in order for me to continue to exist in the world and to do all the things that I am trying to do to help others. But to be aware of our areas of narcissism, um, to take on enough humility to see that the context in which we live is not, and the context that we see is not the only context, but then also to make decisions about how we are going to love from based on that wider understanding. Martin Luther defined sin as turning in on oneself. So believing that, my perspective, my needs, my wants, my way of seeing things is the only way, the only thing that matters, that truly exists. And so to open ourselves up to other perspectives, to other ideas, to other people's needs, and then taking all of that and then determining how we're going to respond is, I think is where Fromm is trying to get, is what Fromm is trying to get at here. So part of what we did at this retreat that I was telling you about with the main passage from the washing of the feet is we looked at three different stories from the Bible about Jesus acting, because it says in the washing the feet story, just as I have loved you, love one another. And so we ask the question, how does Jesus show love? And so I picked out these different passages. And since it's starting to get late, I don't want us to have to go through all of these, but if you're interested, you can take a look at some of these other ones. But I want to look at the paralytic story real quick because I think it's helpful to it's a helpful example of how context matters and how different people take different perspectives on things. Um, so Matthew 9, I'm sure you're familiar with this story and ones that are similar. Just then, some people were carrying a paralyzed man lying on a bed. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." Then some of the scribes said to themselves, "This man is blaspheming." But Jesus, perceiving their thoughts, said, "Why do you think evil in your hearts? For which is easier, to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he then said to the paralytic, "Stand up, take your bed, and go to your home." And he stood up and went to his home. So the thought here being, if Jesus if Jesus tells us that he has loved us, us kind of universal us, and we look at this story, there are clearly some people in this story who did not feel that they were loved in this story, namely the scribes, because they don't like what Jesus is doing. They feel like this person who is paralyzed and his sins are being forgiven is, kind of usurping in some way some of their power by, regaining some of his own dignity and his own power as a person. Um, does that sound familiar at all?
Mhm.
Um, they, think that Jesus is trying to usurp some of their power by claiming to, be able to forgive sins, which is, this is blasphemy because only God can forgive sins, yada yada yada. Um, but to think about, to really dig deep into these stories and think about in what way is Jesus showing these people love, even if they can't perceive it, and who else is involved in this situation in the context that I'm thinking about in terms of how I'm going to move forward, what decision I going to make before I make that decision and before I take action um, to practice my love in this situation. Who are the different players? What will they experience as love? What won't they experience as love? And how do I navigate through all of that? because in this particular situation, we could say, well, Jesus is showing love for everyone in the situation because he's responding to the faith of the friends who are helping the paralyzed man and, kind of honoring that. He's taking that burden off of them that they no longer have to carry this person around. Um, the paralytic, the paralytic himself is, obviously healed and his sins are forgiven. So I'm sure he's feeling pretty loved in this situation. At least momentarily, maybe as he, goes off and realizes he's got to get a job and, deal with the secondary consequences of what's happened to him. Maybe he's going to get a little more um, ambivalent about it. But for right now, he's feeling pretty good. And then we've got these scribes who, are the people in the story who really are never going to feel like they've been loved. But if we assume that Jesus is showing them love because he has loved us, all of us universally, then in what way is this love? Well, Jesus is helping them to see the errors of their ways, even if they're not ready to really perceive it. Um, he is showing them an example of how their assumptions about people who have disabilities and where those disabilities come from is harming that person and harming the communities and the relationships with one another. um, and so even though they're not necessarily ready to hear that yet, that's how Jesus responds, because Jesus is concerned about the person with less power in the situation and making sure that they're taking care of them. And Jesus is concerned about, planting those seeds in people whose hearts are pretty hardened to any of this stuff. And so if you're, as you're reading these types of stories of Jesus acting and trying to figure out this whole, how do I show love to people I don't like? How do I show love to everyone in a situation that I've gotten myself into, even if, the decision that I make or the way that I respond and the next thing I do is going to, make somebody unhappy. If different people have different perspectives on what I should do and I have to choose one, somebody's not going to be happy with me and they're not going to feel like I have shown love to them. But what would Jesus do? Get out your silicone wristband from 1995 and try to think about the patterns that you see in terms of how Jesus behaves in the world. The cleanses the temple story is one of my favorite ones because Jesus is pretty violent there. It is a direct conflict with the whole turn the other cheek. Just be passive, be a rug, be a doormat to the world, because Jesus sees an injustice being done and he acts pretty definitively in response to it. And so, if we are to love like Jesus, then I think it is legitimate and even maybe mandated that we ask questions like, in what circumstances are we to metaphorically cleanse the temples of our world? And that's not an easy question to answer, but I think it's something that we have to consider. So thoughts there.
Well, I mean, that jives with the meme of what would Jesus do, and it says overturning tables and whipping people is not off the table.
Yep. Right. Right.
Well, yeah, I think that's helpful. It's not that you're gonna, do things like that, but cleaning it out. It's like um, you don't have to live with toxicity. You can clean it out.
Mm-hmm. And
You know,
sometimes that's showing love, because there are going to be people who observe you doing that and say, "Oh, it's okay for me to stand up for myself. It's okay for me to, um, make
yeah,
hard decisions that are going to offend other people." Um,
exactly. But it doesn't mean that you don't love um, somebody that would be toxic to you, or a situation that would be toxic to you. It just means that um, you can clean it up.
Hmm.
You don't have to live with the toxic stuff.
Yeah. If you have, I think if you have the right perspective, if you're thinking about, love as a decision and as a discipline, and that you are
Yeah,
willing to acknowledge the places where you have, those spaces of narcissism and turned inwardness, I think that's the best that we can do in any given situation.
yeah,
Loving people, period, doesn't always feel like love to them. And definitely loving people that we don't like, I think, doesn't always need to feel like love to them. And
yeah,
sometimes the best way to love them is to do something that you know that they're not going to like.
yeah. I agree with that. I thought that was interesting where it says love isn't natural.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. It's only love as a tool for my own survival, for my own thriving, using other people is natural. But
Yeah,
true loving, truly sacrificing my own needs and wants for someone else is not natural. It's not biological. It's not part of our evolution. If we were designed to love, to truly love, then we would all die because we would all give up, what allows us to survive fundamentally, like, food and water and shelter and those types of things. The only way that it would truly work is if everybody was like that all the time. Um, but
yeah,
that's not how evolution works. As soon
yeah,
as you get one person who realizes that if they're selfish, they can get more than everybody else and have a better chance of surviving, then the whole system flips.
yeah.
And so it's not natural, but that's what we're called to be, unfortunately. So, Karen, once again, I am going to sort of answer the question, not as definitively as last week, but I am going to sort of answer the question. How do I love people I don't like? First of all, you don't, but God does. So remembering that love is not natural, love is not something that we are capable of really doing at all, but because God is capable of loving them, we can trust that God will use us to show that love. And so I think starting from a place of prayer and humility is always really important to say, I don't know how to love this person that I don't like. So, God, I really, really need you to work in me and through me to show love to this person, however that looks, whether that looks like me telling them the hard truth and them deciding that they're going to cut off our relationship because somebody's got to tell them, or whether that looks like me, gently trying to expose them to different ways of thinking. Um, whether that, sometimes, I mean, it's just people I don't like because I changed my question from last week about different political views. Um, Sometimes I'm wrong, right? Sometimes I don't like you because I'm wrong, not because you're wrong. And so we have to ask God and try to be as serious about it as possible and say, show me the places in which I am wrong in this situation and help
Hmm.
me to confess to those, both inwardly and, if appropriate, outwardly to the person that I have been potentially treating poorly because I don't like them. That certainly takes a lot of a lot of humility and a lot of practice. Practice listening for God's voice. I love this story. I wanted to share this story with you. Um, how to listen for God's voice in our everyday lives and figure out, how we should how we should behave. What does love look like in this particular situation? Because, like we've see in any given example from Jesus' life or any given example from our own lives, it's never an easy answer. But this story is from Jennifer Cameron, who's a minister in the Presbyterian Church. Um, she says, no one was certain why the Park family's dog came to the baseball game, but Rover was there. Rover, deciding to live up to his name, took a walk and ended up in the outfield. Once Rover got there, turmoil ensued. Players yelled at Rover, the umpires yelled at Rover, people in the stands yelled at Rover. Confused and scared by all the noise, Rover ran all over the field, unsure what to do. Suddenly, Rover stopped, perked up his ears, and headed straight to a woman on the third base side who was calling out, Rover, Rover. With a yip of joy, Rover leaped into Megan Park's arms. Rover had heard a voice he knew and trusted. So this little parable that she writes kind of has this this moral. When people who have been formed by Scripture hear the voice of God in the world, they are drawn to it, knowing it to be their primary allegiance, the way to follow. So just like Rover is out there being overwhelmed by different voices and different possibilities and different things that he might do, but he hears that voice that he's familiar with and knows that it can be trusted, then he suddenly knows what to do. And so practicing listening for God's voice by reading scripture, by interpreting the life of Jesus so that we can love just like Jesus loved is a really good way for us to be prepared for figuring out how to love people that we don't like. Because when we're in these situations and there are a million different ways that we could respond and different people are telling us to go in different directions, we have to listen for God's voice, because God's voice is the one that is going to guide us in the right way to go.
Mhm.
Remember that, we are called to love people even if we don't like them, especially if we don't like them. There is a sense of honor in that call, that some of the passages that we looked at today talked about how the way that God chooses to be represented in the world is through us. And that's a pretty big responsibility. Um, that the only way that the only way that the world is going to know about God is if we show them, if we tell them. If we're not loving, then we're not from God, and people aren't going to know who God is. And so that's a pretty big responsibility. But we know, back to topic number one, we're not the ones who are doing the loving. God is doing it through us, and so that gives us that sense of comfort and hope that maybe this could actually work out okay. And so, bringing back again from the very beginning, our John chapter 13. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So, if we want the world to know who we are, then this is what we're called to do. Not because we can do it, not because it's easy, but because God promises to work it through us. So there it is.
That's good.
What I got for today.
That's good.
Any other thoughts? Cindy, you've been awfully quiet for a long time.
I'm still pondering the part that where revenge is going to be worthy.
It's hard. It's hard when it's real life, right? That we have these, and I think that's probably part of why we do teach ourselves to read the Bible in such a wishy-washy, you know, fluffy morality kind of way. Because if we can just tell kids, turn the other cheek, it's okay. You can let people treat you like that because someday God's going to take you to heaven and everything's going to be all right. Um, it doesn't really fix anything, but it gives you something to grasp onto that's a little more tangible. But the real interpretation, the real stuff is much harder. much harder. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that. I think that's actually part of the process, is acknowledging how much you don't like it.
I asked Pastor, I don't remember which pastor it was. It wasn't Pastor Bob, but I asked one time, why is being a Christian so hard? Because the more you try, the more you learn, the harder it gets.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have an answer either. So
I think the answer is because it's not natural.
yeah.
I think that's a good question for another musings class.
Why is being a Christian so hard?
Well, it's that thing about you're not of this world,
Mm-hmm.
and yet you are.
Yeah.
You have to live in this world, but how do you do that? It's just a constant struggle for me.
Well,
Believe it or not, I work really hard at it, but
I think step one is being aware that it's a constant struggle. You're further along than a lot of people.
oh yeah. Well, I'm
Anything
getting
else,
old.
Ryan? You got anything wrappy uppy for us today?
Nope, it's just 11 o'clock my time. So
Yeah, we'll get you to bed. All right. Well, next week or next month, our last question that we've got on the list, and as we can add some more. But we've got, does God have a plan for my life? So
Well, that'll be interesting.
that should be an easy one, right?
No.
All right. Well,
We're all
thank
done.
you all. I hope you all have a good night. Get some sleep. And then we'll try this whole loving other people thing again tomorrow.
Speak
Okay,
for
thank you.
yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody.
all right, thanks.
Thank you.
Night.
Good to see everybody.